Have you ever watched a film from Hollywood's golden age and found yourself captivated by a face unlike any other? Gentle, refined, almost intangible in its quiet magnetism. If so, there's a good chance you've witnessed the art of Leslie Howard. His presence in classics like Gone with the Wind draws you in, not because he thunders across the screen, but because he seems to glide. He was that rare actor whose mildest glance could convey volumes. And yet, behind the gentle manner, behind the sophisticated accent, there was a force of conviction so strong it might just have cost him his life. This is the story of a man who walked away from the glamour of Hollywood at the height of his fame, only to serve his homeland when it needed him most. A man whose death aboard a civilian plane shot down by Nazi fighters remains a mystery, shrouded in the rumors of intelligence missions and secret negotiations. A man who, in the end, chose duty over safety, possibly paying for that choice with his life. In the early 1900s, London was a swirl of tradition and transition. The city embraced all at once the elegance of Edwardian society and the rumblings of social change that would only grow louder across the decades. Leslie Howard Steiner was born into this dynamic environment on April 3, 1893. It was a complicated heritage that would shape his perspective for years to come. He was part British, part Hungarian Jewish. His father, Ferdinand Steiner, had come from Hungary in search of better prospects, eventually taking the more anglicized last name Stainer or Steiner, depending on which official document you happen to find. His mother, Lillian, was English. Young Leslie's dual background introduced him to two cultural worlds at once, and by the time he was a teenager, his refined accent and elegant manner would become part of his trademark on stage and screen. In London at the dawn of the 20th century, a theater lover might have brushed shoulders with the likes of George Bernard Shaw, or wandered into a local production that would soon become the talk of the country. Amid this theatrical bustle, Leslie's father worked as a stockbroker, providing a comfortable life for the family, but not exactly an artistic one. By most accounts, Leslie seemed to gravitate toward stories, reading them, watching them performed, and soon enough dreaming of telling them himself. He had a quiet, observant nature. Friends would later recall how even as a young boy he seemed to absorb details around him, the shape of a stranger's hat, the tone of a passerby's voice, and store them away in his mind. That eye for nuance would one day lend an uncanny realism to his acting, as though he truly became the characters he portrayed. Yet in those early days, the stage was not a foregone conclusion for him. Like many young Londoners of that generation, Leslie followed a conventional path. After finishing school, he took a job as a bank clerk. For a while, it seemed he would lead a perfectly ordinary life behind a ledger and a desk. But fate and the world's unraveling had other plans. When World War I broke out, Leslie was among the countless Englishmen who enlisted to serve. The war itself was a seismic event that shook Europe's foundations, a catastrophic conflict that introduced trench warfare, modern artillery, and a new level of human suffering. Leslie served on the Western Front, and while the precise details of his experiences there remain piecemeal at best, he was private and rarely spoke of them in depth. He did suffer trauma. Shell shock, as it was called at the time, left him with inner scars that would need healing long after the guns fell silent. The transformation began in a hospital ward. As Leslie recovered, he discovered that writing stories, reciting poems, and immersing himself in dramatic readings helped soothe his nerves. Therapists at the time encouraged creative outlets for soldiers struggling with wartime trauma. Through these exercises, Leslie tapped into a previously unrecognized reservoir of artistic energy. He found comfort in slipping into different characters, an escape from the memories that haunted him. It was like stepping into a new skin, if only briefly, letting him leave behind the horrors he'd witnessed in the trenches. Others noticed his talent. Nurses, fellow patients, and visiting doctors were taken with how effortlessly he brought dramatic pieces to life. Soon, the idea took shape in his mind. If something as simple as acting could bring him solace, perhaps it could be a calling. By the time Leslie was fully discharged and returned to civilian life, the London he came back to was forever changed. So many families had lost loved ones. Entire neighborhoods had been emptied of young men. The city was in a phase of mourning, but also forging ahead, determined to find joy wherever it could. The theater scene bounced back with new vigor. Audiences, craving relief from the darkness of recent years, flocked to comedic plays, romances, and lively musicals. Into this environment stepped Leslie, brimming with quiet ambition. He made his way onto the West End stage, first in minor roles where he was barely noticed, then in more prominent roles that showcased his gentle charisma. Patrons spoke admiringly of the new young actor whose eyes flickered with emotional depth and whose voice seemed effortlessly to evoke empathy. One of the earliest breakthroughs came in 1920 with a play where Leslie took a supporting role. Critics commended him for his subtlety, a rarity in an era when theatrical acting often demanded more bombast to reach the back rows. Leslie's approach was introspective. Instead of magnifying every gesture, he mastered a natural style that felt real and present, like a confidant quietly sharing his heart. Audiences found something refreshingly modern in that understated approach. It wouldn't be long before casting directors started to make note of the actor with the haunting gaze. A few years later, Leslie crossed the Atlantic for a stint on Broadway. New York was every bit as frenetic as London, but with a distinct swagger. Manhattan was still riding the wave of the Roaring Twenties, a decade of jazz flappers and seemingly boundless optimism, until the crash of 1929 changed the picture. But in those years of bright lights and bigger dreams, the Broadway stage was a cherished institution. Theater critics, always on the lookout for fresh talent, were intrigued by Leslie's British nuance, which felt dignified yet somehow playful. He soon secured roles that solidified his reputation as a thinking person's actor, someone who could bring literate and sometimes intellectual scripts to life without making them feel stilted or pretentious. In the late 1920s, the technology of film was advancing rapidly. Talkies had recently replaced the silent era. Hollywood was scouring theatrical communities on both sides of the Atlantic, snapping up anyone who showed promise in delivering lines well. Leslie, with his soft-spoken yet mesmerizing voice, was exactly the kind of actor they wanted. He found himself courted by studios that promised him roles in prestigious adaptations of popular plays, as well as original scripts. And so, tentatively at first, he journeyed west to that sun-drenched land of palm trees and cinematic illusions, Hollywood. Early on, Leslie displayed a certain skepticism about the movie-making machine. While many actors lost themselves in the swirl of starlets, mansions, and high-end parties, Leslie never seemed fully comfortable with the glitz. He was drawn to the artistry of film, how a camera could capture the subtlest shift of an eyebrow or a fleeting grin, but less enchanted with the relentless marketing and commercial demands. Producers often wanted him to play the gentle scholar, the aloof romantic, or the sensitive poet, types they believed he could inhabit effortlessly. And indeed he did. Films like Berkeley Square, 1933, and The Scarlet Pimpernel, 1934, underscored his unique ability to be both dashing and pensive, an unusual combination that appealed to sophisticated moviegoers. Around that time, critics tagged Leslie as the thinking woman's heartthrob. This label carried a mix of admiration and mild condescension, implying that while he might not be the muscular, swashbuckling hero, he was the one you could picture discussing poetry or existential philosophy over tea. He quickly grew weary of being pigeonholed, yet for studios, typecasting was a common business practice. They saw Leslie as the gentle aristocrat or the earnest intellectual, and that was the role they kept pushing him toward. For a while, he went along, partly because he believed in perfecting any role he took, partly because he needed to keep afloat in a notoriously fickle industry. Then came the offer to portray Ashley Wilkes in David O. Selznick's grand epic, Gone with the Wind, 1939. At first glance, Ashley Wilkes seemed like the role Leslie had been born to play. A quiet, kind Southern gentleman, trapped by old loyalties and overshadowed by the fiery drama around him. Yet behind the scenes, Leslie despised the part. He reportedly found Ashley Wilkes to be dull, spineless, a man who wanders through the Civil War without ever truly planting his feet. Leslie wrote in a letter to a friend in England that he feared the role would be a terrible bore, though he recognized the film itself might be monumental. Whether he took the role for the paycheck, for the contractual obligations, or simply because the entire production was shaping up to be the biggest thing Hollywood had ever done, one can only guess. But he did take it, and ironically, it became the role most people would remember him for. Gone with the Wind was an unprecedented sensation. It won a raft of Academy Awards, catapulting its cast into cinematic immortality. From the grand sets to the emotional storyline, it captured hearts worldwide. For Leslie, however, the experience reinforced his ambivalence about Hollywood. He found the spectacle overwhelming, the behind-the-scenes politics draining, and the role itself creatively unfulfilling. Some accounts suggest that after filming wrapped, he breathed a deep sigh of relief and vowed that his days in Hollywood were numbered. The timing of that vow was uncanny because history was about to intervene in a way that would pull him back across the Atlantic. By 1939, Europe was once again on the precipice of war. Nazi Germany had shown its expansionist ambitions, swallowing up territory at an alarming rate. Britain was preparing to stand firm, but the mood was one of grim foreboding. When war officially broke out in September, Leslie felt a call that transcended any career aspirations. He had served once before, after all, and that experience had left him with a sense that, in dire times, every citizen owed a duty to the nation. But he was no longer a fresh-faced young soldier. This time, he had a different set of tools: fame, charisma, a gift for words. And so at the peak of his career, when many actors would have dug deeper into the Hollywood scene to secure their next contract, Leslie boarded a ship bound for England, determined to offer his talents to the British war effort. Once home, he wasted no time. He connected with various British film agencies and government offices that recognized the potency of cinema as a propaganda tool. Leslie starred in films like Pimpernel Smith, 1941, and The First of the Few, 1942, both designed to boost morale and encourage steadfastness against the Axis threat. In Pimpernel Smith, a reimagining of the earlier Scarlet Pimpernel story, Leslie portrayed an unassuming archaeology professor who helps refugees escape from Nazi territory. The film was laced with anti-Nazi sentiment and was widely viewed as a morale booster. Audiences found the parallel to real-world events both alarming and inspiring. Leslie's portrayal was a clarion call for courage and decency, embodying the kind of quiet heroism he believed was vital to defeating tyranny. Beyond the film set, Leslie took to the airwaves. He delivered radio broadcasts aimed at uplifting British spirits, speaking calmly and clearly about the importance of unity, resilience, and belief in the cause of freedom. His gentle voice proved surprisingly persuasive, at times more moving than a fire and brimstone address. Ordinary listeners found solace in his measured tones. The man who once played mild-mannered roles on screen had now become, in many respects, a warrior of words. The British government, particularly the Foreign Office, recognized how Leslie's celebrity status and impeccable diction might be useful beyond Britain's borders. Spain and Portugal were officially neutral, but leaned in complex ways that could affect the Allied war effort. There were key figures in both countries with sympathies that aligned either with Germany or with the Allies, and diplomatic relations were a tangled web. Leslie was dispatched on various cultural missions, ostensibly to promote British film, foster goodwill, and encourage pro-British sentiment. Unofficially, many have speculated that his duties went far deeper. From the vantage point of the 21st century, we know the British intelligence services, MI5 and MI6, were adept at recruiting people from all walks of life to aid in the war. Artists, journalists, and traveling performers sometimes carried coded messages or tried to glean information from foreign officials in casual conversation. The question has often been asked, was Leslie Howard an actual spy for MI6, or was he simply a high-profile public diplomat? Documentary evidence is scarce. The official papers surrounding Leslie's missions remained sealed for decades, fueling rumors that he was covertly gathering intelligence or helping coordinate clandestine meetings with Spanish officials who sympathized with the Allies. Some accounts suggest that German intelligence labeled him a highly dangerous propagandist. Regardless of his exact role, there's no doubt he was working on behalf of the British cause, and that the Germans took notice. His visits to Spain, combined with the influential content of his recent films and broadcasts, made him a figure worth monitoring. He was part of a new front, an information war, fought not with bullets but with messages that could sway hearts and minds. By 1943, the tide of the war was beginning to turn, though it was far from decided. Leslie continued to travel between the Iberian Peninsula and Britain, presumably to conduct more film business, give speeches, and possibly engage in discreet negotiations. In late May, after finishing work in Portugal and Spain, he planned to fly from Lisbon back to Bristol, England, aboard a British Overseas Airways Corporation civilian flight. This was a routine flight path, at least it should have been. On June 1, 1943, Leslie boarded the flight along with several other passengers, including his close friend and business manager, Alfred Chenholz. None of them realized they'd become targets of the Luftwaffe. The official German line, repeated for years, was that their fighters believed Winston Churchill himself was on that plane. Indeed, Churchill had been in North Africa and was returning to Britain around that time, but he took a completely different route. For the Germans, who would have relished an opportunity to assassinate the British Prime Minister midair, a civilian passenger plane was an easy target if Churchill was rumored to be aboard. But even decades later, questions abound. Why this particular plane on this particular day? Many flights traveled the same corridor. Not all were shot down. And how likely is it that the Germans truly mistook an aircraft filled with mostly ordinary passengers for a top-secret prime ministerial flight? The plane never stood a chance against the German fighters that intercepted it over the Bay of Biscay. Reports suggest it went down swiftly. There were no survivors. The event sent a shockwave of grief through Britain. Official statements were sparse, as wartime censorship often restricted the details. But word got out quickly that Leslie Howard, one of the most prominent British actors of his day, was dead. Speculation flared that his death was not an accident, of mistaken identity. Perhaps the Nazis had deliberately targeted him to send a message. Enough with the British propaganda. Some rumors ventured that he'd been carrying secret dispatches or had just completed a crucial negotiation with Spanish officials about limiting Nazi influence. As is often the case, the secrecy of war fueled the darkest conspiracies. For Leslie's family, the heartbreak was compounded by the lack of official clarity. The British government offered no grand ceremony, no national day of mourning. This might seem strange for a star of Leslie's stature, but then again, the middle of a war is hardly conducive to public commemoration. Or perhaps, if one believes the espionage theory, the government chose to keep quiet about certain aspects of his work. Even decades later, many of the relevant files remained classified, delaying any thorough examination of what really happened. The press coverage at the time fixated on Churchill as the presumed target. Newspapers spun a narrative that the Germans, in typical barbarous fashion, had shot down an innocent passenger plane in pursuit of the Prime Minister. This narrative, while plausible, left a gaping question. If Churchill wasn't on board, did the Germans know Leslie Howard was, and did they care? One line of speculation suggests that if the Germans had identified the plane as carrying Leslie Howard, someone they considered a formidable morale builder for the Allies, they might have regarded it as fair game. Indeed, war logic can be chillingly pragmatic. Neutralizing an influential figure can be as significant as taking out a military leader. In the post-war years, a swirl of theories continued. Some investigators tried to piece together passenger lists, radio transmissions, and routes. Others combed through Leslie's personal correspondences, looking for hints of clandestine meetings. Friends and family offered recollections that Leslie had confided in them about sensitive discussions, though nobody could say exactly what those entailed. For many decades, the British government kept tight-lipped. Declassified documents released toward the end of the 20th century shed only partial light on the matter, leading some to conclude we may never know the entire truth. What we do know is that Leslie Howard died far from any battlefield, yet, in a sense, he died in the service of his country. Whether or not he was an official spy, he was undoubtedly a public face of British resolve, a cultural combatant whose films and broadcasts lifted morale during a terrifying chapter in world history. His final flight became an enduring symbol of the hazards faced not only by soldiers at the front, but also by those working behind the scenes to influence the war in subtler ways. In that sense, he embodies a tragedy that resonates well beyond 1943. Sometimes, the bullets of war strike those who never held a gun. In the immediate aftermath, Hollywood's reaction was subdued. By 1943, the U.S. film industry had turned much of its attention to morale-boosting pictures and newsreels supporting the Allied effort. That an A-list British star had been gunned down by Nazi planes was indeed shocking, but it arrived amid daily reports of entire bomber crews lost over Europe. Even so, for those close to Leslie, the loss was profound. His co-stars, such as those from Gone with the Wind, expressed sorrow and bafflement at how a man so gentle could meet such a violent end. Olivia de Havilland, who had played Melanie in the film, once remarked on how Leslie's calm presence on set was a balm during that often tumultuous production. Clark Gable, larger than life on screen, was said to be quietly shaken by the tragedy. An odd silence surrounded the event in Britain as well. Yes, newspapers covered the story, but there was no state funeral, no grand eulogy from Parliament. The war carried on. Families worldwide dealt daily with the wrenching news of lost sons, husbands, and fathers. Leslie Howard, for all his fame, seemed to slip into that massive, faceless tragedy. In time, References to him in popular media became mostly confined to Ashley Wilkes, the gentle Southerner who represented the passing of an era. It's rather ironic that the character Leslie reportedly disliked the most is the one that overshadowed his memory. But to many who grew up between the wars, Leslie Howard was not Ashley Wilkes. He was the voice on the radio telling them to hold fast during the Blitz. He was the refined presence in films like Pimpernel Smith, encouraging them to believe in Britain's ultimate victory, to see the Nazi menace for what it was, cruelty cloaked in grandiose spectacle. In a world that sometimes celebrates the loudest and most flamboyant personalities, Leslie's brand of quiet resolve may have been overlooked, both in life and in the official histories that followed. Yet it remains deeply significant to those who look closer. Many decades after his death, writers and documentary filmmakers revisited the story. They interviewed surviving family members, combed through archives, and collected testimonies from others who had served in British intelligence. Some concluded he was a pawn in a larger game, while others believed the simplest explanation. The German pilots aimed for Churchill, not Leslie. Still others posited a third scenario, that the Germans saw Leslie as Churchill's confidant, or at least as a symbolic figure of the British war effort, and took the chance to eliminate him. This swirl of theories, never fully resolved, has given Leslie Howard a somewhat spectral presence in histories of World War II. He haunts the margins, a star who fell from the sky under circumstances that remain partly unexplained. Today, if you mention Leslie Howard in conversation, many older film buffs will immediately think of Gone with the Wind, the iconic poster with Vivian Leigh, Clark Gable, Olivia de Havilland, and yes, that thoughtful-faced Englishman standing quietly on the side. But if you dig deeper, you'll find that he was so much more. Here was a man who could have stayed in Los Angeles, earning a fortune, living in comfort and safety while the bombs rained down on his home country an ocean away. Instead, he chose to go back to Britain in its darkest hour, to speak out when words were needed, to put his fame on the line, and possibly to lend a hand in intelligence work as well. One might say that in sacrificing material gain for moral conviction, Leslie Howard earned a place in the lineage of actors turned activists, artists who refused to stand by when the world demanded their involvement. But his story is also a cautionary tale about the fog of war and the murky nature of espionage. Sometimes even well-intentioned actions can place a person in mortal danger. Sometimes propaganda is more lethal than bullets. And for all the illusions Hollywood sells us, there are moments when reality is far more dramatic and heartbreaking than anything on the big screen. One seldom cited anecdote can give a measure of the man's character. Just weeks before his final flight, Leslie was said to have confided to a friend in Lisbon that he dreaded traveling by air in wartime. He knew the risks of commercial flights being misidentified or deliberately targeted. But, he added, how can I speak about courage if I won't risk traveling where I must? That quiet statement encapsulates who Leslie Howard was at his core, a man who understood the power of example. If he was to inspire others to stand firm, he had to do the same himself, even if it meant taking a seat on a plane that might never land. Another lesser-known tale revolves around how he treated refugees who'd found their way to England. Stories circulated of how Leslie discreetly donated funds or offered to arrange small roles or backstage jobs for émigré actors who had fled Nazi Europe with nothing but the clothes on their backs. While not widely publicized, these gestures earned him deep gratitude among those who were trying to rebuild their lives in Britain. Indeed, one wartime refugee, interviewed years later, recalled a note from Leslie praising his courage in adversity and encouraging him to continue performing. For in Leslie's words, Art that sustains the soul is always worth pursuing, especially in times of darkness. As the decades pass, we see the outlines of his story become clearer in some respects, while certain chapters remain forever opaque. Was he truly an official agent for British intelligence, or just a passionate patriot who happened to serve in a gray zone between culture and covert operations? Historians have posited that he was at least tangentially involved in intelligence gathering. We may never see absolute proof, but the testimonies of those who knew him and the suspicious circumstances of his final flight point in that direction. The fact that official documents remained locked away for so long only deepened the sense of secrecy. This leads to the enduring puzzle. How do we, as admirers of classic film and as seekers of history's truths, reckon with a man who wore so many hats? Leslie Howard was at once a British gentleman, a Hollywood star, a father, a quiet benefactor, and possibly an intelligence asset. Perhaps the best we can do is preserve all those facets, accept the contradictions, and marvel at the complexity. It's precisely this complexity that keeps his memory alive, far more than a single performance as Ashley Wilkes ever could. One might argue that history cheated Leslie Howard of the full measure of recognition he deserved. Imagine a scenario where he'd survived the war, returning triumphantly to Britain to continue making movies or writing plays that depicted the horrors and heroics of that global conflict. He might have aged into one of those dignified elder statesmen of cinema, guiding younger talent, shaping film culture for generations. Instead, we're left with the haunting final image, an aircraft over the Bay of Biscay, a swirl of Nazi fighters, and a star who vanished from the world stage in a flash. Yet, even without an official state funeral or a nationwide day of mourning, Leslie's passing did not go unnoticed among ordinary citizens. Letters to newspapers at the time expressed a sincere grief for a man they felt was one of them, an Englishman who had chosen to do his duty. Some correspondents wrote tearfully about his broadcasts, describing how they'd huddled around radios during the Blitz, hanging on his every word, imagining him as a calm uncle who understood their terror, but urged them to stay brave. There is a power in that kind of quiet heroism that lingers across generations. In a sense, the bullet that found him was intended to silence not just an actor, but an entire wave of British spirit and cultural influence. Whether it was a mistaken identity or a targeted strike on the Allies' most captivating voice, the result was the same: a gentle star extinguished in a violent act. The story of Leslie Howard is an enduring testament to the idea that artists can wage war on injustice even without stepping onto the battlefield. They fight with the power of storytelling, the subtlety of performance, the allure of cinema. Their weapons are words and images that lodge in the public mind, shaping opinions and lighting emotional fires. If Leslie Howard was indeed targeted, it's because the enemy recognized that power. If his death was a twist of misfortune, then it highlights the capricious cruelty of war, which spares no one, not even the gentle souls who sought only to inspire hope.